Hello, everyone. I thought I would read a book called My Cave Life in Vicksburg. In the spring of 1863, during the Civil War, the Union Army for 47 days bombarded the town of Vicksburg in the lower Mississippi River Valley. And during that time, the citizens of the city built caves on the hillside to protect themselves against the bombardment. And some of these caves were single family places, but some of them could accommodate up to 200 people. So, not quite social distancing like we are having to endure right now, but it definitely disrupted their life as we are experiencing now during the 2020 pandemic. So, I will begin. It's a little book. I got it in Vicksburg when I visited in December of 2015. I actually have a great uncle that fought there with the Wisconsin 6th Artillery Unit. So the book was written, it says on the title page, by a lady. Okay. About the author. When Mary Webster Loughborough arrived in Vicksburg, Mississippi on April 15, 1863, she had planned nothing more than a pleasant visit to the Hill City on the Mississippi River. Never suspecting that she would become an unwilling guest during the next few months, enduring danger and privation during bombardment and siege of the Confederate stronghold. With monstrous iron shells screaming through the air, leaving trails of smoke and fire both night and day, Mary joined many local citizens who fled for safety to hastily dug caves in the city's hills. In a daily journal of life in the besieged city, Mary recorded her experiences, fears, and anxieties, horrors, tragedies, and even joys and light-hearted moments. She wrote well. Her observations were both eloquent and descriptive, as well as candid. No account of siege of Vicksburg is more vividly told. Though born in New York City in 1837, Mary had grown up in Missouri, and her sentiments were Southern. She was an attractive, well-educated woman of 22 when she married a young St. Louis attorney, James Moore Loughborough, in 1859. The war between the states divided loyalties in Missouri more than probably any other state, and when Union advocates gained the upper hand, Mary Loughborough became a refugee, following the fortunes of her husband, a staff officer in the Confederate Army and of the Confederacy itself. She resided as close as possible and as was practical to Colonel Loughborough and the scene of the battle. Following the surrender of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, Mary Loughborough, unable to follow her husband any further, returned to St. Louis. There she shared her journal with friends. They convinced her of its merit, and in 1864 it was published by a New York firm and was an immediate success. In keeping with the customs of the time, when it was thought improper for a woman's name to appear in print, she signed her work by a lady. The book was republished in 1881. Following the war, James and Mary Loughborough and her family moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, where he was a railroad official and a state senator. He died July 31st, 1876. A widow with 4 children to rear, Mary Loughborough relied upon her literary talents, authoring several books and editing a monthly magazine, Southern Ladies' Journal. She died August 26, 1887, the day after her 50th birthday, and is buried in Little Rock. The edition, this edition of My Cave Life in Vicksburg is a photographically reproduced copy of an original volume, which is given to the Old Courthouse Museum in 1951 by a member of the Loughborough family. Okay, so Chapter 1. It has been said that the peasants of the Campagna, in the semi-annual visit to the Pontine Marshes, arrive piping and dancing, but it is seldom they return in the same merry mood, the malaria fever being sure to affect them more or less. Although I did not leave Jackson on the night of the 15th piping and dancing, yet it was with a very happy heart and a very little foreboding of evil that I set off with a party of friends for a pleasant visit to Vicksburg. Like the peasant, I returned more serious and with a dismal experience. How little do we know what we rapidly our feelings may change. We had been planning a visit to Vicksburg for some weeks, and anticipating pleasure in meeting our friends. How gladly in a few days we left it, with the explosions of bombs still sounding in our ears. How beautiful was this evening! The sun glowed and warmed into mellow tints over the rough forest trees, over the long moss that swung in slow and stately dignity, like old time dancers, scorning the quick and tripping movements of the present day. Glowing and warming over all, this evening sun, this mellow, pleasant light, break in warm tints over the rugged ground of the plantation, showed us the home scenes as we passed. The sober and motherly cows going home for the evening's milking through the long lanes between the fields, where the fences threw shadows across the road, making strange, weird figures of the young cold shadows, lean and long limbed and distorted. The mothers, tired of eating the grass that grew so profusely, were standing in quiet contentment, or drank from the clear runs of water. And so we passed on by the houses where the planter sat on his veranda, listening to the voice of his daughter, reading the latest paper, while round her fair head, like a halo, the lingering beams of the sun played. And along the black river, big black with its slow, sluggish tide, dark like the Stygian stream, it flowed in the mist of the evening, the twilight. And soon we see Vicksburg, a classic ground forever in America. The Hudson must now yield the palm to the Father of Waters. Our interest will center around spots haloed by the deeds of our countrymen. I had thought during the first bombardment of Vicksburg that the town must have been a ruin, yet very little damage has been done, though very few houses are without evidence of the first trial of metal. One I saw with a hole through the window. Behind was one of the corresponding size through the panel of the door, which happened to be open again. The corner of the piano had been taken off, and on through the wall the shot passed. One also passed through the chimney, and yet the inhabitants live in their homes, those who have not lost some loved one, happy and contented, not knowing what moment the house may be rent over their heads by the explosion of a shell. "Ah," said I to a friend, "how is it possible you live here?" "After one is accustomed to the change," she answered, "we do not mind it, but becoming accustomed, that is the trial." I was reminded of the poor man in an infected district who was met by a traveler and asked, "How do you live here?" "Sir, we die," was the laconic reply. And this is becoming accustomed. I looked over this beautiful landscape, and in the distance plainly saw the Federal transports lying quietly at their anchorage. Was it a dream? Could I believe that over this smiling scene in the bright April morning the blight of civil warfare lay like a pall, lay by the hearthstones, making moan in many bereaved heart, looking forward with vague fears to the coming summer? What soul in the land but has felt and witnessed this grief, this unavailing sorrow for the brave and untimely dead? I thought of the letter from the sorrowing one in Iowa, whose son, a prisoner, I had nursed, receiving with the last breath words for the distant, unconscious mother; of her sorrow in writing of him in his distant grave; of her pride in him, her only son. How many in the land could take her hand and weep over a mutual sorrow? And in the hospital wards, men who still hold the name of Americans, together were talking of battles, prisoners, and captors, when each told the other of acts of bravery performed on hostile fields, and took out pictures of innocent babes, little children, and wives to show each other, all feeling a sympathy and interest in the unknown faces. Verily, war is a species of passionate insanity. While standing and thinking thus, the loud booming of the guns in the water battery startled me, the smoke showing that it was the battery just below me that opened, I was told, on what was thought to be a masked battery on the opposite shore. No reply was elicited, however, and on looking through the glass, we saw in the line of levee between the river and the Federal Canal a spot where new earth seemed to have been thrown up, and branches of trees had been laid quite regularly in one place. This was all. General Lee, however, had ordered the spot to be fired on, and the firing continued some little time. Our ride that evening had been delightful. We sat long on the veranda in the pleasant air, with the soft melody and rich swell of music from the band floating around us, while ever and anon my eye sought the bend of the river, 2 miles beyond, where the Federal transports, brought out in bold relief by the waning crimson light of the evening, lay in seeming quiet. Still resting in Vicksburg seemed like resting near a volcano. Chapter 2. At night I was sleeping profoundly, when the deep boom of the signal cannon startled and awoke me. Another followed, and I sprang from my bed, drew on my slippers and robe, and went out on the veranda. Our friends were already there. The river was illuminated by large fires on the bank, and we could discern plainly the huge black masses floating down with the current, now and then belching forth fire from the sides, followed by the loud report, and we could hear the shells exploding in the upper part of town. The night was one of pitchy darkness, and as they neared the glare thrown upon the river from the large fires, the gunboats could be plainly seen. Each one, on passing the track of the brilliant light on the water, became a target for the land batteries. We could hear the gallop in the darkness of couriers upon the paved streets. We could hear the voices of the soldiers on the riverside. The rapid firing from the boats, the roar of the Confederate batteries, and above all the screaming, booming sound of the shells as they exploded in the air around the city, made at once a new and fearful scene to me. The boats were rapidly nearing the lower batteries, and the shells were beginning to fly unpleasantly near. My heart beat quickly as the flashes of light from the portholes seemed facing us. Some of the gentlemen urged the ladies to go down into the cave at the back of the house, and insisted on my going, if alone. While I hesitated, fearing to remain, yet wishing still to witness the termination of the engagement, a shell exploded near the side of the house. Fear instantly decided me, and I ran, guided by one of the ladies, who pointed down the steep slope of the hill. Another shell exploded near the foot, and ceasing to hesitate, I flew down, half sliding and running. Before I had reached the mouth of the cave, two more exploded on the side of the hill near me. Breathless and terrified, I found the entrance and ran in, having left one of my slippers on the hillside. I found two or three of our friends had already sought refuge under the earth, and we had not been there long before we were joined by the remainder of the party, who reported the boats opposite the house. As I had again become perfectly calm and collected, I was sorry to find myself slightly fluttered in a state of rapid heart beatings, as shell after shell fell in the valley below us, exploding with a loud rumbling noise, perfectly deafening. The cave was an excavation in the earth, the size of a large room, high enough for the tallest person to stand perfectly erect, provided with comfortable seats, and altogether quite a large and habitable abode, compared with some of the caves in the city. Were it not for the dampness and the constant contact with the soft, earthy walls. We had remained but a short time, when one of the gentlemen came down to tell us that all danger was over, and that we might witness a beautiful sight by going upon the hill, as one of the transports had been fired by a shell and was slowly floating down as it burned. We returned to the house, and from the veranda looked on the burning boat, the only one, so far as we could ascertain, that had been injured, the other boats having all passed successfully by the city. We remained on the veranda an hour or more, the gentlemen speculating on the result of the successful run by the batteries. All were astonished and chagrined. It was found that very few of the Confederate guns had been discharged at all. Several reasons have been assigned. The real one was supposed to have been the quality of the fuses that were recently sent from Richmond, and had not been tried since their arrival. This night of all others they were found to be defective. The lurid glare from the burning boat fell in red and amber light upon the house, the veranda, and the animated faces turned toward the river, lighting the white magnolias, paling the pink crape myrtles, and bringing out in bright distinctness the railing of the terrace, where drooped in fragrant wreaths the clustering passion vine, fair and beautiful, but false, the crimson, wavering light. I sat and gazed upon the burning wreck of what an hour ago had thronged with human life, with men whose mothers had this very night prayed for them, with men whose wives tearfully hovered over little beds, kissing each other, sleeping lid for the absent one. Had this night made them orphans? Did the smooth, deceitful current of the glowing waters glide over forms loved and lost to the faithful ones at home? O mother and wife, you will pray and smile on until the terrible tidings come. Lost at Vicksburg, lost at Vicksburg! In how many a heart the name for years will lie like a brand, lie until the warm heart and tried soul shall be at peace forever. Chapter 3. At breakfast on this morning of the 17th, we heard discussed the question whether there was a masked battery of the opposite shore or not. After some words on the subject, pro and con, we ranged the shore with a glass, seeing what the gentlemen believed to be a battery. They had been talking some moments, when I took the glass and saw a number of Federal soldiers waking on the levee toward the spot where the battery was supposed to be. Several others seemed to be engaged on this very place, removing the branches. I called one of the gentlemen to look. I had given up the glass but a few moments, when a volume of smoke burst from the embankment, and two shells were sent, one after the other, exploding at the depot just below us. It was indeed a battery with two guns, which commenced playing on the city vigorously. We were to leave that morning, and hearing that the cars would not venture up to the depot, went to a point below where we found many anxious persons awaiting their arrival. We entered the cars, and were sitting quiet, securely and comfortably, when it was whispered around, much to the consternation of passengers, that they were ordered to approach the depot as near as possible and take on freight, and thus we were carried up under shelter of a high bluff, with many misgivings on my part, as shell after shell exploded on the hill above us. A nervous gentleman leaned forward and told me that we were in great danger, and speaking in the same manner to many of the ladies, suggested that, if we made the request, the conductor would doubtless back into a safe place. Although so frightened, his mode of relief was so evidently selfish that the gentleman began joking him most unmercifully. And looking out of the window, although I felt sympathy for the poor fellow, I could not but be amused at the ludicrous scene that presented itself. The porters bringing the baggage and small freight from the depot acted as if wild, not halting to await the course of a shell, then dashing forward, determined to reach the cars before another came. Two negroes were coming with a small trunk between them and a carpet bag or two, evidently trying to show others of the profession how careless of danger they were, and how foolish niggers were to run dat sort of way. A shell came ricocheting through the air and fell a few yards beyond the braves, when lo, the trunk was sent tumbling and landed bottom upward. The carpet bag followed, one grand somerset, and amid the cloud of dust that arose, I discovered one porter doubled up by the side of the trunk, and the other crouching close by a pile of plank. A shout from the negroes on the cars, and much laughter, brought them on their feet, brushing their knees and giggling, yet looking quite foolish, feeling their former prestige gone. Yet gentlemen and servants avoided the depot as much as possible, and whenever a portion of earth was seen to arise in a small volume, accompanied by smoke, men of both colors immediately ran, without casting a look behind, swiftly in the opposite direction. Gentlemen of color, generally in their haste, stumbling and turning one or two somersets before reaching a place of safety. And so the shell continued coming, exploding on all sides, yet not happening to reach us. Soon the grand sound of the whistle was heard, and after our long suspense, we felt the motion of the carts again, and we were glad to leave Vicksburg, with the sound of the cannon and noise of the shell still ringing in our ears. Some young lady friends of mine were laughing and telling me of their experience during the danger of the previous night, of the fright and trouble they were in at the time of the gunboats passed. Major Watts of the Confederate Army had given a very large party, which they attended, one dressed in corn-colored silk trimmed with black lace, another in blue silk trimmed with white point, and still another in white lace. In the confusion and alarm, As the first shell fell, one of the young ladies who was dancing with the brigadier general clasped her hands and exclaimed, "Where shall we go?" In jest he said, "To the country for safety." Believing him serious, in the confusion that ensued, she told her young friends. They set out alone with all speed, frightened and trembling. Fortunately, a gentleman friend, discovering their absence, overtook and proceeded with them. As a shell would be heard coming, he would cry, "Fall!" and down they would drop in the dust, party dresses and all, lying until the explosion took place, then up with wild eyes and fiercely beating hearts, flying with all speed onward. After running about a mile in the fewest moments possible, and falling several times, they stopped at the first house, and remained until their friends sent out for them in carriages. If you could see in our party dresses when we reached home, and our hair and the flowers full of dust, you would never have forgotten us," cried one. "Ah," said another, "we laughed gaily this morning, for we are leaving the guns behind us, but last night it was a serious business, and we absolutely ran for our lives. How delighted I was with the quiet rest of our home in Jackson. I mentally forswore Vicksburg during the war, but man proposes and God disposes." Chapter 4. Our quiet was destined to be of short duration. We were startled one morning by hearing that Colonel Grierson of the Federal Army was advancing on Jackson. The citizens applied to General Pemberton to protect them. He answered that there was no danger. Suddenly the ladies' carriage and saddle horses were pressed, and the clerks and young men of the town were mounted on them and started out to protect us. I was told that the first time they met the Federal troops, most of them were captured, and we heard of them no more. We need not have feared, for Colonel Grierson was spoken of everywhere, so some ladies from the district through which he passed afterward told me, as a gentleman who would not allow his men to treat anyone with the slightest disrespect, or take the least article of the citizen's house, and they all treated ladies courteously. There was not one instance of unkindness to any human being, so far as I could learn. You should have the thanks of every brave man and Southern woman. This man, though an avowed enemy, scorned to torture or wage war on God's weaker creation. Again the rumor came that from Canton a large Federal force was advancing on Jackson. Jackson was to be defended, which I doubted. Soon General Pemberton left and went to Vicksburg, Mrs. Pemberton to Mobile. Batteries were being erected in different parts of the town, one directly opposite the house I was in. I stood considering morning where it was best to go, and what it was best to do, when a quick gallop sounded on the drive, and a friend rode hastily up and said, "Are you going to leave?" "Yes," I answered, "but I have not decided where to go." "Well, I assure you there is no time for deliberation. I shall take my family to Vicksburg as the safest place, and if you will place yourself upon my charge, I will see you safely to your husband." So the matter was agreed upon, and we were to leave that evening. Still I was in doubt. The Federal army was spreading all over the country, and I feared to remain where I was. Yet I thought, may I not be in danger in Vicksburg? Suppose the gunboats should make an attack? Still it was true, as my friend had said, we were in far more danger here from the rabble that usually followed a large army, and who might plunder, insult, and rob us. No, to Vicksburg we must go. Very hurriedly we made our arrangements, packing with scarcely a moment to lose, not stopping to discuss our sudden move and the alarming news. Our friends, also, were in as great a panic and dismay as ourselves. Mrs. A. had some chests of heavy silver. Many of the pieces were such that it would have taken some time to bury them. Her husband was absent, and she feared to trust the negro men with the secret. Another friend feared to bury her diamonds, thinking in that case she might never see them more; feared also to retain them, lest through negroes' tales the cupidity of the soldiers might become excited, and she be a sufferer in consequence. Every tumult in the town caused us to fly to the doors and windows, fearing a surprise at any time, and not only ladies with pale faces and anxious eyes met us at every turn, but gentlemen of anti-military dispositions were running hither and thither with carpet bags and little valises, seeking conveyances, determined to find a safe place, if one could be found, where the sound of a gun or smell of powder might never disturb them any more. And as they ran, each had an alarming report to circulate. So, with the rush and roar of dray, wagon, and carriage, the distracting reports of the rapid advance of the Federal army, and the stifling clouds of dust that arose, withal, we were in a fair way to believe ourselves any being or object but ourselves. The depot was crowded with crushing and elbowing human beings, swaying to and fro, baggage being thrown hither and thither, horses wild with fright, and negroes with confusion. And so we found ourselves in a car amid the living stream that flowed and surged along, seeking the mobile cars, seeking the Vicksburg cars, seeking anything to bear them away from the threatened and fast depopulating town. Chapter 5. Leaving the threatened, teeming town behind us, we moved slowly on, and our friends, my little one and myself, toward Vicksburg. Ah, Vicksburg, our city of refuge, the last to yield that will be, and within thy homes we will not fear the footsteps of the victorious army, but rest in safety amid thy hills. And those who we love so dearly will comfort and sustain us in our frightened and panic-stricken condition, will laugh away our woman's fears, and lighten our hearts from the dread and suffering we have experienced. Yet is there any place where one is perfectly safe in these terrible times? As we traveled along, the night air blowing so refreshingly upon us through the open window, our seats so quiet, the motion of the car so soothing, my friends soon gave unmistakable signs of the deep sleep that had fallen upon them. The quiet of the night, the air so fragrant, the heavens above us so calm and starlit. I leaned my head against the window and looked into the darkness. How calm and earnest the thoughts that came to me after the unquiet and restlessness of the day. The blessed hope of the heavenly home seemed doubly gracious. Or how longingly I looked upon the veil that lay between our world and the beyond. Ah, the beyond, where Christ is gone, that our life there may be perfected through him. The beyond, where many a night like this my eyes have looked upon the stars, and my soul trembled and panted, wistfully longing for more knowledge of the life above, wistfully longing for the martyr child, that suffered and died upon my bosom, the child whose life on earth was so much a part of my own, whose heavenly life I wished so much to influence my own. And I seek, I know not what, as I gaze upon these worlds above. I dare not ask for a revolution. But ah, could I penetrate beyond the stars and catch one ray of the glorious life! Yet the consciousness of a refined and pure existence is never near me, as my mind separates from the earth, gives itself up to intangible and yearning inquiries that will never be satisfied until I too stand within the presence of my Creator. Oh, this night time, this starlit, clear, and most pure heaven before us! Does not one see oneself more clearly when looking upward with the ever undefined motion that we feel when gazing at the heavens at night? Does not our own unworthiness, our soul's need of a Savior, come to us as our conscience, overcoming the callousness of the day and the world, whispers to us of many derelictions from our duty, of prayers hastily said over, of opportunities for good to our fellow men lost? The soft answer, the kind word, and cheering smile to the world weary, all have been passed by, and we see where good to one of the least of these might have made a life happier. And as to the pure, all things are pure. So we, as we pant for the heavenly life and the ennobling existence belonging to it, see more clearly the imperfections in this, and in our daily duties, and our need of a mediator with him, to whose pure eyes we are wholly unworthy. Alas, so unworthy that with this life our worthiness can never begin. As we passed along nearing Vicksburg, we could see camps and campfires, with the dim figures of men moving around them. We could see the sentinel guarding the Black River Bridge, silent and erect, looking in the darkness like a dusky statue ornamenting some quaint and massive bridge of the old countries. and farther, masses of men in the road marching quietly in the night time, followed by the artillery. Long lines of wagons, too, passing through the ravines. Now the white cover seen on the brow of the hill. Losing sight of them again, we hear the shout of the teamsters, the crack of the whip, and again catch sight of a white top through trees, and the occasional song of a wagoner. At the depot soldiers were crowded, waiting to go out, and on our arrival at our friends, we were so weary with the excitement and turmoil of the day, were glad to rest our tired heads in calmness and peace, with no fears for the morrow or restless forebodings of evil. Upon reading the papers the next morning, almost the first article that caught my eye was an order for General Pemberton, insisting on all non-combatants leaving the city. Heretofore, he said, I have merely requested that it should be done. Now I demand it. Ah, cried I, have we no rest for the sole of our foot? Must we again go through the fright and anxiety of yesterday? We cannot leave here, replied my friend. Where can we go? Here we are among our friends. We are welcome, and we feel in safety. Let us at least share the fate of those we love so much. If we leave, we cannot tell to what we may be exposed. Even now, probably, the Federal army occupied Jackson. If we go into the country, we are liable at any time to be surrounded by them, and to whom can we apply for protection from the soldiery? We must stay here, even if the gentlemen say go, which I fear they will. We must urge them to allow us to remain, for you know they can refuse us nothing. Oh, we are so quiet and peaceful, we must stay, come what will. When the gentlemen came, we talked to the order with them. At first they said we must leave, but we entreated them to let us stay, representing our deplorable condition in a country overrun by soldiers, the great danger of trying to go to Mobile by railway, the track having been partly destroyed between Meridian and Jackson. We declared that we would almost starve, that we would meet any evil cheerfully in Vicksburg, where our friends were, where we were carefully housed, quiet and contented. So laughingly they said they were completely overcome by our distress, and would arrange it so that we could stay if we wished. But remember, they said, if trouble comes, you must meet it with your eyes open. Yes, we said, we can meet trouble where you are, cheerfully. All seemed to think that the matter would be decided some distance from Vicksburg, and that General Pemberton wanted to cast the responsibility from his shoulders if the worst came and ladies were endangered in the city. Chapter 6. We settled ourselves delightfully. With our sewing in the morning and rides in the evening, our home was very pleasant, very happy and quiet. Rumors came to us of the advance of the Federal troops in Black River, yet so uncertain were the tidings and so slow was the advantage gained, we began to doubt almost everything. M was stationed below at Warrenton and came only occasionally to see us, as the gunboats were threatening that point. Still, we were in a manner already cut off from the outer world, for the cars had ceased running farther than the Black River Bridge, where General Pemberton had stationed his forces, fortifying and awaiting an attack. Still, every morning the papers would tell us all was right, and our life passed on the same. Almost every day we walked up the Sky Parlor Hill and looked through the glass at the Federal encampment near the head of the abandoned canal. We would see plainly, also below at a point called Brown and Johnson's Landing, the passing of trains and wagons, carrying supplies to the fleet below. We would also discern troops and mounted men on the opposite shore, though some miles away. Again, at the head of the canal, out in the stream, listlessly lay the dark forms of the gunboats, now two lying quite near each other. Then perhaps a group of three, or often one alone, manned by negroes, as with the aid of the glass we could see them passing to and fro. We could see also the little tugboats carrying dispatches from one to the other. We supposed as frequently after their visit a transport or gunboat would put on steam and follow them up the river. We could see couriers galloping from groups of tents along the shore up to where we presumed the mass of the soldiers were encamped. Altogether, the Federal encampment and movements were far more stirring and interesting than the quiet fortified life of Vicksburg. waiting with calm and bristling front, the result of the energetic movements beyond. We met frequently on Sky Parlor Hill, an acquaintance on General Pemberton's staff. We seemed to watch with interest operations on shore above and below us. We could see that Vicksburg was as attentively observed by the Federal troops. The gunboats that stood out in the stream above seemed to be acting as sentinels, or on a kind of picket duty, I might call it, as a man in uniform constantly paced the deck with a large glass under his arm, which he frequently raised and took a survey of the city. But Vicksburg must have been a sealed book to him among her hills from that point of view. One night we heard heavy cannonading an hour or two, ceasing, and then commencing again quite early in the morning, undoubtedly from the vicinity of Warrenton. How little we thought that was the commencement of music that would ring in our ears for weeks to come. How little we thought it at the beginning of trouble. That night the sky in the south was crimsoned by the light of a large fire, the cause we could not learn. The next day we heard that the little village of Warrenton had been burned by shells thrown from the boats. M came in that evening and told us that the gunboats had been amusing themselves by throwing shot and shell at the fort. That very little damage had been done except setting fire to some of the cotton composing the fort, which was still smoldering and burning slowly under the earthworks. We were told soon after by some of our friends that the fort at Warrenton had been quietly evacuated, at least. All the guns had been taken from it and brought into Vicksburg with ammunition stores, etc. The troops were left there as a blind for the time being. All this M did not tell me. It must have been a trial for the men to lie perfectly quiet, enduring a steady fire that they were unable to return. However, the time came when these men could look back to the shelling of Warrenton as a slight matter in comparison with the storm of shot and shell that rained upon them in the rear of Vicksburg. And now began my excitement. M was below and exposed to the firing we heard every morning and evening, and I prayed for him so fervently, feeling how utterly powerless I was, and how merciful and powerful our Father would be. Saturday came, and with it the news that a battle was going on between the Federal troops and General Pemberton's forces at Black River, and I saw the blanching of bright cheek, and felt with a heavy heart that the hopes of happiness for many a year to come, of a dear friend, hung upon a life that would be bravely ventured there today. Oh, the terrible suspense of that day, when feeling that, let the result be what it would, and we trembled for it, the lives of our friends were all in all to us. Chapter 7. Sunday the 17th, the memorable 17th of May. As we were dressing for church and had nearly completed the arrangement of shawl and gloves, we heard the loud booming of cannon. Frightened, for at this time we knew not what an hour would bring forth. Seeing no one who might account for the sudden alarm, we walked down the street, hoping to find some friends that could tell us if it were dangerous to remain away from home at church. I feared leaving my little one for any length of time, if there were any prospect of an engagement. After walking a square or two, we met an officer who told us the report we heard proceeded from our own guns, which were firing upon a party of soldiers who were burning some houses on the peninsula on the Louisiana shore. He told us also it had been rumored that General Pemberton had been repulsed, that many citizens had gone out to attend to the wounded of yesterday's battle. All the ministers and surgeons that could leave had also gone. Still, as the bell of the Methodist church rang out clean and loud, my friend and I decided to enter, and were glad that we did so, for we heard words of cheer and comfort in this time of trouble. The speaker was a traveler who supplied the pulpit this day, as the pastor was absent ministering to the wounded and dying on the battlefield. This was a plain man of simple, fervent words, but with so much of heart in all his exercises that we felt after the last hymn had been sung, the last prayer said, that we had been in a pure atmosphere. After the blessing, he requested the ladies to meet and make arrangements for lint and bandages for the wounded. As we returned home, we passed groups of anxious men at the corners with troubled faces. Very few soldiers were seen. Some battery men and officers needed for the river defenses were passing hastily up the street. Yet in all the pleasant air and sunshine of the day, an anxious gloom seemed to hang over the faces of men, a sorrowful waiting for tidings that all knew now would tell of disaster. There seemed no life in the city. Sullen and expectant seemed the men, tearful and hopeful the women, prayerful and hopeful, I might add, for many a mother, groaning in spirit over the uncertainty of the welfare of those most dear to her, knelt and laid her sorrows at the foot of that throne, where no earnest suppliant is ever rejected, where the sorrow of many a broken heart has been turned in resignation to His will, who afflicts not willingly the children of men. And so, in all the dejected uncertainty, the stir of horsemen and wheels began, and wagons came rattling down the street, going rapidly one way, and then returning, seemingly without aim or purpose. Now and then a worn and dusty soldier would be seen passing with his blanket and canteen. Soon straggler after straggler came by, then groups of soldiers worn and dusty with the long march. "What can be the matter?" we all cried, as the streets and pavements became full of these worn and tired looking men. We sent down to ask, and the reply was, "We are whipped, and the Federals are after us." We hastily seized veils and bonnets and walked down the avenue to the iron railing that separates the yard from the street. "Where are you going?" we asked. No one seemed disposed to answer the question. An embarrassed, pained look came over some of the faces that were raised to us. Others seemed only to feel the weariness of the long march. Again we asked, "Where on earth are you going?" At last one man looked up in a half surly manner and answered, "We are running." "From whom?" exclaimed one of the young girls of the house. "The Feds, to be sure," said another, half laughing and half shamefaced. "Oh, shame on you!" cried the ladies. "And you running!" "It's all Pem's fault," said an awkward, long-limbed, weary-looking man. "It's all your own fault. Why don't you stand your ground?" was the reply. "Shame on you all!" cried some of the ladies across the street, becoming excited. I could not but feel sorry for the poor worn fellows, who did seem indeed heartily ashamed of themselves, some without arms, having probably lost them in the first break of the companies. "We are disappointed in you," cried some of the ladies. "Who shall we look to now for protection?" "Oh," said one of them, "it's the first time I ever ran. We are Georgians, and we never ran before, but we saw them all breaking and running, and we could not bear up alone." We asked them if they did not want water, and some of them came in the yard to get it. The lady of the house offered them some supper, and while they were eating, we were so much interested that we stood around questioning them about the result of the day. "It is all General Pemberton's fault," said a sergeant. "I'm a Missourian, and our boys stood it almost alone, not knowing what was wanted to be done, yet fighting as long as possible, every one leaving us, and we were obliged to fall back. You know, madam, we Missourians always fight well, even if we have to retreat afterward." "Oh," spoke up an old man, "we should have fit well, but General Pemberton came up instead. Stand your ground, boys. Your General Pemberton is with you." And then, bless you, lady, the next we seed of him he was sitting on his horse behind a house, close to it that, and we'd seen that. We thought, "'Tain't no use if he's going to sit there." We could not help laughing at the old man's tale and his anger. Afterward, we were told that General Pemberton behaved with courage, that the fault lay in the arrangement of troops. And where these weary and worn out men were going, we could not tell. I think they did not know themselves. Chapter 8. At dark, the fresh troops from Warrenton marched by, going out to the entrenchments in the rear of the city, about 2 miles. Many of the officers were fearful that the fortifications, being so incomplete, would be taken, if the Federal troops pushed immediately on, following their advantage. As the troops from Warrenton passed by, the ladies waved their handkerchiefs, cheering them and crying, "These are the troops that have not run. You'll stand by us and protect us, won't you? You won't retreat and bring the Federals behind you." And the men, who were fresh and lively, swung their hats and promised to die for the ladies, never to run, never to retreat, while the poor fellows on the pavement, sitting on their blankets, lying on the ground, leaning against trees, or anything to rest their wearied bodies, looked on silent and dejected. They were not to blame, these poor weary fellows. If they were unsuccessful, it is what many a man has been before them, and then endurance of the long fast in the rifle pits, and coolness amid the showers of ball and shell thrown at devoted Vicksburg afterward, show us that men, though unfortunate, can retrieve their character. "There has been many a life lost today," said a soldier to me, "many an officer and man." "Ah, truly, yes," I said, for the ambulances had been passing with wounded and dead, and one came slowly by with officers riding near it, bearing the dead body of General Tillman, the blood dripping slowly from it. We were told also of a friend who had been mortally wounded. What a sad evening we spent, continually hearing of friends and acquaintances left dead on the field or mortally wounded, and being brought in ambulances to the hospital. We almost feared to retire that night. No one seemed to know whether the Federal army was advancing or not. Some told us that we were many miles away, and others that we were quite near. How did we know but in the night we might be awakened by the tumult of their arrival? The streets were becoming quiet. The noise and bustle had died out with the excitement of the day, and save now and then the rapid passing of some officer or army wagon, they were almost deserted. And what will the morrow bring forth? I thought as I leaned from the balcony of my room. Will these streets echo to the tread of the victorious army? I shrank from the thought. Without protectors, what might be our fate? To be turned from our homes, perhaps widows and orphans. But the heavens above so calm, so smooth and soothing, the quiet glide of the silent river, and the wind swaying the trees with a monotonous wave, quelled and laid these thoughts of evil, and the blessed trust and faith in Him who is all powerful came with renewed balm to my anxious heart. Chapter 9. The next morning all was quiet. We heard no startling rumors. The soldiers were all being gathered together and taken out into the rifle pits. Vicksburg was regularly besieged, and we were to stay at our homes and watch the progress of the battle. The rifle pits and the entrance were almost 2 miles from the city. We would be out of danger, so we thought, but we did not know what was in preparation for us around the bend of the river. The day wore on. Still all was quiet. At night our hopes revived. The Federal troops had not yet come up. Another calm night and morning. At 3 o'clock that evening the artillery boomed from the entrenchments, roar after roar, followed by the rattle of musketry. The Federal forces were making their first attack. Looking out from the back veranda, we could plainly see the smoke before the report of the guns reached us. Our anxiety was great. Indeed, having been told by gentlemen the night before that the works in the rear of Vicksburg was anything but of a superior kind. The discharges of musketry were irregular, yet to us who were thinking of the dear ones exposed to this frequent firing, the restless forebodings and unhappiness caused by the distant din of battle pained us indeed. After listening for some time to the reports which sounded to us in the distance, like the quick successive droppings of balls on sheet iron, again and again sounded the cannon like thunderings near us. At every report our hearts beat quicker. The excitement was intense in the city. Groups of people stood on every available position where a view could be obtained of the distant hills, where the jets of white smoke constantly passed out from among the trees. Some of our friends proposed going for a better view up on the balcony around the cupola of the courthouse. The view from there was most extensive and beautiful. Hill after hill arose in the distance, enclosing the city in the form of a crescent. Immediately in the center and east of the river the firing seemed more continuous, while to the left and running northerly the rattle and roar would be sudden, sharp, and vigorous, then ceasing for some time. The hills around near the city, and indeed every place that seemed commanding and secure, was covered with anxious spectators, many of them ladies, fearing the result of the afternoon's conflict. To the extreme left and north near the river the warfare became general, while toward the center of the firing became less rapid. What a beautiful landscape lay out before us! Far in the distance lay the cultivated hills, some already yellow with grain, while on other hills and in the valleys the deep green of the trees formed the shadows in the fair landscape. It was amid the clump of trees on the far distant hillside that the Federal batteries could be discerned by the frequent puffings of smoke from the guns. Turning to the river, we could see a gunboat that had the temerity to come down as near the town as possible and lay just out of reach of the Confederate batteries with steam up. Two more lay about half a mile above and nearer the canal. Two or three transports had gotten up steam and lay near the mouth of the canal. Below the city, a gunboat had come up and landed, out of reach, on the Louisiana side, striving to engage the lower batteries of the town, firing about every 15 minutes. While we were looking at the river, we saw two large yawls start out from shore, with two larger boats tied to them and full of men. We learned that they were the Federal prisoners that had been held in the town, and today paroled and sent over to the Federal encampment, so that the resources of the garrison might be husbanded as much as possible, and the necessity of sustaining them avoided. The idea made me serious. We might look forward truly now to perhaps real suffering. Yet I did not regret my resolution to remain, and would have left the town more reluctantly today than ever before, for we felt that now indeed the whole country was unsafe, and that our only hope of safety lay in Vicksburg. The little boats with their prisoners had gained the opposite shore, and we could see the liberated men walking along the river bank. We could see also the little steam tug coming down and stopping at the gunboat near the city. It also visited the transports and the gunboats near the canal, and then leaving, steamed with much swiftness up the river toward the mouth of the Yazoo. And looking again with the glass in the rear of the city, we could see the Southern soldiers working at their guns and walking in the rear of a fort on a hill near by. The Federal troops were too distant to discern. Some ambulances were coming into the city, probably bringing the wounded from the field. We saw an officer coming in with his head bound up and his arm in a sling, his servant walking by his side, leading his horse. Aside from the earnest group of spectators moving from one place to another, the town seemed perfectly quiet. Looking again toward the river, the gunboat near the lower batteries kept its old position, slowly firing at the lower part of the city and far over on the other shore, walking rapidly. I observed the figures of the freed prisoners near the canal, and fast becoming indistinct even with the aid of a glass. So twilight began falling over the scene, hushing to an occasional report the noise and uproar of the battlefield, falling softly and silently upon the river, separating us more and more from the raging passion surging around us, bringing only the heaven above us and the small space of life we occupy distinctly to our eyes. Chapter 10. From gentlemen who called on the evening of the attack in the rear of the town, we learned that it was quite likely, judging from the movements on the river, that the gunboats would make an attack that night. We remained dressed during the night. Once or twice we sprang to our feet, startled by the report of a cannon, but after waiting in the darkness of the veranda for some time, the perfect quiet of the city convinced us that our alarm was needless. Next day, two or three shells were thrown from the battlefield, exploding near the house. This was our first shock, and a severe one. We did not dare go to the back part of the house all day. Some of the servants came and got down by us for protection, while others kept on with their work as if feeling a perfect contempt for the shells. In the evening we were terrified and much excited by the loud rush and scream of mortar shells. We ran to the small cave near the house and were in it during the night, by this time wearied and almost stupefied by the loss of sleep. The caves were plainly becoming a necessity, as some persons had been killed on the street by fragments of shells. The room that I had so lately slept in had been struck by a fragment of a shell during the first night, and my utter hopelessness of ever seeing the morning light. Terror-stricken, we remained crouched in the cave, while shell after shell followed each other in quick succession. I endeavored by constant prayer to prepare myself for the sudden death I was almost certain awaited me. My heart stood still as we would hear the reports from the guns and the rushing and fearful sound of the shell as it came toward us. As it narrowed, the noise became more deafening. The air was full of the rushing sound. Pain started through my temples. My ears were full of the confusing noise, and as it exploded, the report flashed through my head like an electric shock, leaving me in a quiet state of terror, the most painful that I can imagine. Cowering in a corner, holding my child to my heart, the only feeling of my life being the choking throbs of my heart that rendered me almost breathless. As singly they fell short or beyond the cave, I was aroused by a feeling of thankfulness that was of short duration. And again the terrible fright came over us in that night. I saw one fall in the road without the mouth of the cannon, like a flame of fire making the earth tremble, and with a low singing sound the fragments sped on in their work of death. Morning found us more dead than alive, with blanched faces and trembling lips. We were not reassured on hearing from a man who took refuge in the cave that a mortar shell in falling would not consider the thickness of earth above us a circumstance. Some of the ladies, more courageous by daylight, asked him what he was in there for if that was the case. He was silenced for an hour when we left. As the day wore on, and we were still preserved, though the shells came as ever, we were somewhat encouraged. The next morning we heard that Vicksburg would not in all probability hold out more than a week or two, as the garrison was poorly provisioned, and one of General Pemberton's staff officers told us that the effective force of the garrison, upon being estimated, was found to be 15,000 men, General Loring having been cut off after the battle of Black River with probably 10,000. The ladies all cried, "Oh, never surrender!" but after the experience of the night, I really could not tell what I wanted, or what my opinions were. How often I thought of them upon the battlefield, and his anxiety for us in the midst of this unanticipated danger, wherein the safety lay entirely on the side of the belligerent gentlemen. We were shelling us so furiously at least 2 miles from the city, in the bend of the river near the canal. So constantly dropped the shells around the city that the inhabitants all made preparations to live under the ground during the siege. M sent over and had a cave made in a hill near by. We seized the opportunity one evening, when the gunners were probably at their supper, for we had a few moments of quiet to go over and take possession. We were under the care of a friend of M, who was paymaster on the staff of the same general with whom M was adjutant. We had neighbors on both sides of us, and it would have been an amusing sight to a spectator to witness the domestic scenes presented without the number of servants preparing the meals under the high bank containing the caves. Our dining, breakfast, and supper hours were quite irregular. When the shells were falling fast, the servants came in for safety, and our meals waited for completion some little time. Again they would fall slowly, with the lapse of many minutes between, and out would start the cooks to their work. Some families had light bread made in large quantities and subsisted on it with milk, provided their cows were not killed from one milking time to another, without any more cooking until called on to replenish. Though most of us lived on corn bread and bacon, served 3 times a day, the only luxury of the meal consisting in its warmth, I had some flour and frequently had some hard, tough biscuit made from it, there being no soda or yeast to be procured. At this time we could also procure beef. A gentleman friend was kind enough to offer me his camp bed, a narrow spring mattress which fitted within the contracted cave very comfortably. Another had his tent fly stretched over the mouth of our residence to shield us from the sun, and thus I was the recipient of many favors and under obligations to many gentlemen of the army for delicate and kind attentions. And in looking back to my trials at the time, I shall ever remember with gratitude the kindness with which they strove to ward off every deprivation. And so I went regularly to work, keeping house underground. Our new habitation was an excavation made in the earth and branching 6 feet from the entrance, forming a cave in the shape of a T. One of the wings my bed fitted, the other I used as a kind of a dressing room. In this the earth had been cut down a foot or two below the floor of the main cave. I could stand erect here, and when tired of sitting in other portions of my residence, I bowed myself into it and stood impassively resting at full height. one of the variations in the still shell expectant life. M's servant cooked for us under protection of the hill. Our quarters were close, indeed, yet I was more comfortable than I expected. I could have been made under the earth in that fashion. We were safe at least from fragments of shell, and they were flying in all directions, though no one seemed to think our cave any protection, should a mortar shell happen to fall directly on top of the ground above us. We had our roof arched and braced, the supports of the bracing taking up much room in our confined quarters. The earth was about 5 feet thick above, and seemed hard and compact. Yet poor M, every time he came in, examined it, fearing, amid some of the shocks it sustained, that it might crack and fall upon us. Chapter 11. One afternoon, amid the rush and explosion of the shells, cries and screams arose, the screams of women amid the shrieks of the falling shells. The servant boy, George, after starting and coming back once or twice, his timidity overcoming his curiosity, I was not at all surprised at it. At last gathered courage to go to the ravine near us, from whence the cries proceeded, and found that a negro man had been buried alive within a cave, he being alone at that time. Workmen were instantly sent to deliver him if possible, but when found the unfortunate man had evidently been dead for some little time. His wife and relations were distressed beyond measure, and filled the air with their cries and groans. This incident made me doubly doubtful of my cave. I feared that I might be buried alive at any time. Another incident happened the same day. A gentleman resident of Vicksburg had a large cave made, and repeatedly urged his wife to leave the house and go into it. She steadily refused, and being quite an invalid, was lying on the bed when he took her by the hand and insisted upon her accompanying him so strongly that she yielded, and they had scarcely left the house when a mortar shell went crashing through, utterly demolishing the bed that had so lately been vacated, tearing up the floor, and almost completely destroying the room. That night, after my little one had been laid in bed, I sat at the mouth of the cave with the servants drawn around me, watching the brilliant display of fireworks the mortar boats were making. The passage of the shell as it traveled through the heavens, looking like a swiftly moving star. As it fell, it approached the earth so rapidly that it seemed to leap beyond a track of fire. This night we kept our seats. As they all passed rapidly over us, none falling near. The incendiary shells were still more beautiful in appearance. As they exploded in the air, the burning matter and balls fell like large, clear, blue and amber stars, scattering hither and thither. "Miss M," said one of the more timid servants, "do they want to kill us all dead? Will they keep doing this until we all die?" I said most heartily, "I hope not." The servant we had with us seemed to possess more courage than is usually attributed to negroes. They seldom hesitated to cross the street for water at any time. The boy slept at the entrance of the cave with the pistol I had given him, telling me I need not be afeared that any one dat come dere would have to go over his body first. He never refused to carry out any little article to M on the battlefield. I laughed heartily at a dilemma he was placed in one day. The mule they had mounted to ride out to the battlefield took him to a dangerous locality where the shells were flying thickly, and suddenly stopping, through fright, obstinately refused to stir. It was in vain that George kicked and beat him. Go he would not. So clenching his hand, he hit him severely in the head several times, jumped down, ran home, and left him. The mule stood a few minutes rigidly, then, looking around, and seeing George at some distance from him, turned and followed quite demurely. Each day as the couriers came into the city, M would write me little notes asking after our welfare, and telling me of the progress of the siege. I in return would write to him of our safety, but was always careful in speaking of the danger to which we were exposed. I thought poor M had enough to try him, without suffering anxiety for us, so I made light of my fears, which were in reality wearing off rapidly. Every week he came in to make inquiries in person. In his letters he charged me particularly to be careful of the provisions, that no one could tell what our necessities might be. In one of his letters he said, Already I am living on pea meal, and cannot think of your coming to this. One thing I had learned quite lately in my cave was to make good bread. One of my cave neighbors had given me yeast and instructions. I in turn had instructed a servant so that when we used the flour it could be presented in a more inviting form. One morning after breakfast the shells began falling so thickly around us that they seemed aimed at the particular spot in which our cave was located. Two or three fell immediately in the rear of it, exploding a few moments before reaching the ground, and the fragments went singing over the top of our habitation. I at length became so much alarmed, as the cave trembled excessively for our safety, that I determined, rather than to be buried alive, to stand out from under the earth. So taking my child in my arms and calling the servants, we ran to a refuge near the roots of a large fig tree that branched out over the bank and served as a protection from the fragments of shells. As we stood trembling there, for the shells were falling all around us, some of my gentlemen friends came up to reassure me, telling me that the tree would protect us, and that the range would probably be changed in a short time. While they spoke, a shell, that seemed to be of enormous size, fell, screaming and hissing, immediately before the mouth of our cave, within a few feet of the entrance, sending up a huge column of smoke and earth, and jarring the ground most sensibly where we stood. What seemed very strange, the earth closed in around the shell, and left only the newly upturned soil to show where it had fallen. Long it was before the range was changed, and the frightful missiles fell beyond us, long before I could resolve to return to our sadly threatened home. I found on my return from the walls were seamed here and there with cracks, but the earth had remained firm above us. I took possession again with resignation, yet in fear and trembling. Chapter 12. My past resolution having forsaken me again were the mortar shells heard with extreme terror, and I was many days recovering the equanimity I had been so long attaining. This night, as a few nights before, a large fire raged in the town. I was told that a large storehouse filled with commissary stores was burning, casting lurid lights over the devoted city, and amid all, fell with screams and violent explosions, flinging the fatal fragments in all directions, our old and relentless enemies, the mortar shells. The night was so warm, and the cave so close, that I tried to sit out at the entrance, George saying that he would keep watch and tell when they were falling toward us. Soon the report of the guns would be heard, and George, standing on the hillock of loose earth near the cave, looked intently upward, while I with suspended breath would listen anxiously, as he cried, "Here she comes! Going over!" Then again, "Coming! Falling! Falling right this way!" Then I would spring to my feet and for a moment hesitate about the protection of the cave. Suddenly, as the rushing descent was heard, I would beat a precipitate retreat into it, followed by the servants. That night I could scarcely sleep, the explosions were so loud and frequent. Before we retired, George had been lying without the door. I had arisen around 12 o'clock and stood looking out at the different courses of light marking the passage of the shells, when I noticed that George was not in his usual place at the entrance. On looking out, I saw that he was sleeping soundly, some little distance off, and making fragments of shell falling near him. I aroused him, telling him to come to the entrance for safety. He had scarcely started when a huge piece of shell came whizzing along, which fortunately George dodged in time, and it fell in the very spot where he had so lately slept. Fearing to retire, I sat in the moonlight at the entrance, the square of light that lay in the doorway causing our little bed with the sleeping child to be set out in relief against the dark wall of the cave, causing the little mirror and a picture or two I had hung against the wall to show misshapen links of shadows, tinting the crimson shawl that draped the entrance of my little dressing room uh, with light on the outer folds and darkening in shadow the inner curves, beautifying all the silvery glow of moonlight within the darkened earth, beautifying my heart with lighter and more hopeful thoughts. Whatever the sins of the world may have brought us to, however dark and fearful the life to which man may subject us, our Heavenly Father ever blesseth us alike with the sun's warmth and the moon's beauty, ever blesseth us with the hope that, when our toil and travail here are ended, The peace and the beautiful life of heaven will be ours. Days wore on, and the mortar shell had passed over continually without falling near us, so that I became quite at my ease. In view of our danger, when one of the Federal batteries opposite the entrenchments alerted their range, so that about 6 o'clock every evening Parrott shells came whirring into the city, frightening the inhabitants of caves woefully. Our policy in building has been to face directly away from the river, and all caves were prepared as near as possible in this manner. As the fragments of shells continued with the same impetus over the explosion, in but one direction onward, they were not likely to reach us, fronting in this manner with their course. But this was unexpected. Guns throwing shells from the battlefield directly at the entrance of our caves. Really, was there to be no mental rest for the women of Vicksburg? The cave we inhabited was about 5 squares from the levee. I A great many had been made in the hill immediately beyond us, and near this hill we could see most of the shells fall. Caves were the fashion, the rage, over besieged Vicksburg. Negroes who understood their business hired themselves out to dig them at from $30 to $50 according to the size. Many persons, considering different localities unsafe, would sell them to others who had been less fortunate or less provident, and so great was the demand for cave workmen that a new branch of industry sprang up and became popular, particularly as the personal safety of the workmen was secured and money withal. Chapter 13. It was about 4 o'clock on Wednesday evening. The shelling during the day had gone on about as usual. I was reading in safety, I imagine, when the unmistakable whirring of Parrott shells told us that the battery we so much feared had opened from the entrenchments. I ran to the entrance to call the servants in, and immediately after they entered, a shell struck the earth, a few feet from the entrance, burying itself without exploding. I ran to the little dressing room, and I could hear them striking around us on all sides. I crouched closely against the wall, for I did not know at what moment one might strike within the cave. A man came in, much frightened, and asked to remain until the danger was over. The servant stood in the little niche by the bed, and the man took refuge in the small L where I was stationed. He had been there but a short time, standing in front of me and near the wall, when a parrot shell came whirling in at the entrance and fell in the center of the cave before us all, lying there smoking. Our eyes were fastened upon it, while we expected every moment the terrific explosion would ensue. I pressed my child closer to my heart and drew nearer to the wall. Our fate seemed almost certain. The poor man who had sought refuge within was most exposed of all. With a sudden impulse, I seized a large double blanket that lay near and gave it to him for the purpose of shielding him from the fragments, and thus we remained for a moment with our eyes fixed in terror on the missile of death, when George, the servant boy, rushed forward, seized the shell, and threw it into the street, running swiftly in the opposite direction. Fortunately, the fuse had become nearly extinguished, and the shell fell harmless, remaining near the mouth of the cave as a trophy of the fearlessness of the servant and our remarkable escape. Very thankful was I for our preservation, which was the theme of conversation for a day among our cave neighbors. The incident of the blanket was also related, and all laughed heartily at my wise supposition that the blanket could be any protection from the heavy fragments of shells. Nor was this all. I had occasion to go to the mouth of the cave one evening to speak to George, and there, with an enlightened audience of servants from the surrounding caves collected near him, George was going through a grave pantomime of the whole affair. It seems that he expected the refugee to act the part of preserver in our extremity, and throw out the shell, but as he was disappointed in the matter, he represented him in the most ridiculous manner possible to the audience. Pressing up closely to the wheel of a wagon near by, George extended his eyes, holding out his hand as if with a shield, and shrieking with a semblance of extreme terror that amused his spectators vastly. Then, changing the whole character, he put on the bravest port imaginable, pushing his hat with an independent air on the side of his head, and assuming a don't-care-ish look, he sauntered forward to a large piece of shell that lay conveniently near, caught it with both hands, gave it a careless swing and throw far different from the reality, turned on his heels, walked back to the wagon with the peculiar swinging step of a proud negro, then leaning his arm on the wheel, carelessly surveyed his audience with a look that plainly said, "What you think of that, niggers?" The benefited group immediately began laughing and applauding like a well-trained bevy of claqueurs, in which they were soon joined by George himself. Soon after I received a note from M imploring me to be careful and remain within the cave constantly. I could see that he was restless and troubled in regard to the new peril from the battlefield. And so the weary days went on, the long weary days when we could not tell in what terrible form death might come to us before the sun went down. Another fear that troubled M was that our provisions might not last us during the siege. He would frequently urge me to husband all that I had, for troublesome times were probably in store for us; told me of the soldiers in the entrenchments who would have gladly eaten the bread that was left from our meals, for they were suffering every privation, and that our servants lived far better than these men who are defending the city. Soon the pea meal became an article of food for us also, and a very palatable article it proved. To make it of proper consistency, we were obliged to mix some corn meal with it, which cooked so much faster than the pea meal that it burned before the bread was half done. The taste was peculiar and disagreeable. However, it soon proved unwholesome, for the soldiers were again allowed to draw rations of the remaining corn meal, with the peas and the kernel to be boiled with meat. We were indeed experiencing the rigors and hardships of a siege, for we ate nothing now but bread and meat and bread. Still, we had nothing to complain of in comparison with the soldiers. Many of them were sick and wounded in a hospital in the most exposed parts of the city, with shells falling and exploding all around them. One shell went completely through a hospital in the center of the city without exploding or injuring anyone, save by the severe shock to the invalids. A fragment afterward came through the side of the same house, severely fracturing the hip of a soldier who was lying already wounded. One or two wounded men were also killed by fragments of shell while in the hospital. Chapter 14. Even the very animals seemed to share the general fears of a sudden and frightful death. The dogs would be seen in the midst of a noise to gallop up the street and then to return, as if fear had maddened them. On hearing the descent of a shell, they would dart aside, then as it exploded sit down and howl in a most pitiful manner. There were many walking the street, apparently without homes. George carried on a continual warfare with them, as they came about the fire where our meals were cooking. In the midst of other miserable thoughts, it came into my mind one day that these dogs through hunger might become as much to be dreaded as wolves. Groundless was this anxiety, for in the course of a week or two they had almost disappeared. The horses belonging to the officers and fastened to the trees near the tents would frequently strain the halter to its full length, rearing high in the air with a loud snort of terror as a shell would explode near. I could hear them in the night cry out in the midst of the uproar, ending in a low, plaintive whining of fear. The poor creatures subsisted entirely on cane tops and mulberry leaves. Many of the mules and horses had been driven outside the lines by order of General Pemberton for subsistence. Only mules enough were left belonging to the Confederacy to allow threefold teams to a regiment. Private property was not interfered with. Sitting in the cave one evening, I heard the most heart-rending screams and moans. I was told that a mother had taken a child into a cave about 100 yards from us, and having laid it on its little bed, as the poor woman believed in safety, she took her seat near the entrance of the cave. A mortar shell came rushing through the air and fell with much force, entering the earth above the sleeping child, cutting through the cave, oh, most horrible sight to the mother, crushing in the upper part of the little sleeping head, and taking away the young innocent life without a look or word of passing love to be treasured in the mother's heart. I sat near the square of moonlight, silent and sorrowful, hearing the sobs and cries, hearing the moans of a mother for her dead child, the child that a few moments since lived to caress and love, speaking the tender words that endear so much the tie of mother and child. Oh, the little lonely grave, so far distant, yet so ever present with me. The sunny auburn head that I laid there 6 months after this terrible war began. I could not hear those sobs and cries without thinking of the night, that last night when I held my darling to my heart, thinking that, though so suddenly stricken and so scared, she would still live to bless my life. And the terrible awakening to find that, lying in my arms all my own, as I believed, she was going swiftly, going into the far unknown eternity, sliding from my embrace. The precious life was called by one so mighty, so all powerful, yet so merciful, that I bowed my head in silence. Still the moans from the bereaved mother came borne on the pleasant air, floating through the silvery moonlit scene, saddening hearts that had never known sorrow, and wakening chords of sympathy in hearts that before had thrilled and suffered. Yet it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Yes, better the tender memory of a hidden life that glows in our hearts forever. Better all will say who had known the light and consolation given from on high, when we throw ourselves before his throne in utter wretchedness, and arise strong, strong in the strength that never faileth, the Lord's strength. The desert that hath not known the oasis of life, though blasted and withered by the burning sirocco that passeth over, cannot know the refreshing and gentle drops that being renewed and more tender verdure. How very sad this life in Vicksburg! How little security can we feel with so many around us seeing that morning light that will never more see the night. I could not sit quietly without hearing of so much grief, and leaving my seat, I paced backward and forward before the low entrance of my house. The courthouse bell tolled 12, and though the shells fell slowly still around the spot where the young life had gone out, yet friends were going to and from the place. How blightingly the hand of warfare lay upon the town, even in the softening light of the moon. The closed and desolate houses, the gardens, with gates half open, and cattle standing amid the loveliest flowers in verdure. This carelessness of appearance and evident haste of departure was visible everywhere. The inhabitants in this perilous time feeling only anxiety for personal safety and the strength of their cave homes. The moans of pain came slowly and more indistinct, until all was silent and the bereaved mother slept, I hope, slept to find on waking a dull pressure of pain at her heart, and in the first collection of faculty will wonder what it is. Then her care for the child will return, and the new sorrow will again come to her, gone forever gone. It will take days to fully realize it, and then she will struggle and grow strong. God in His mercy helps the poor human heart that suffers, struggle, and grows strong in these sad years of warfare. No one came now, no word to show that life still throbbed in the silent city. The fresh air told of the coming morning, the guns were still. Peace for a short time reigned in the troubled city, and in the perfect quiet that prevailed, my heart grew heavy, and I once more sought my bed, this time to rest peacefully until the cheerful morning light dawned upon us. Chapter 15. With the dawn came the old unrest and distrust, for the shells were again falling thickly around us, and I passed an hour or two in continual shrinkings and exclamations. At length our tormentors passed farther on, and I again felt relieved from anxiety. At 10 or 12 o'clock we saw, in spite of the continual falling of the shells, gentlemen hurrying toward the river. Soon we heard the Confederate river batteries booming loudly, and then all was silent. What could it mean? I did not venture to look without, and so I sat, waiting for someone to come to me. At last a friend appeared, who in the most triumphant manner told us that the Confederates had routed the Federal fleet. The gunboats had formed in line of battle, sailing down majestically with the Cincinnati, one of the finest boats in the river navy, leading the attack. She came rapidly down around the point of the peninsula, the signal guns silent. When the battery containing the Brooks gun opened on her as she came within range, the first shot cut down the flag, the second struck her side, and the third, the Brooks ball, with the steel wedge, cut into the iron plates near the water's edge. She turned immediate and steamed back up the river in a sinking condition. The remaining boats also changed their course and retired. The Cincinnati had scarcely turned the point when she sank near the shore. "Ah, yes," said the major. "Had it not been the fortunate sinking of the Cincinnati, you would have become conscious of a fearful warfare raging in the city. Had the boats gotten opposite and engaged our batteries, the firing would have been terrific." The major also told us that many ladies had been so much interested in the expected engagement that they had gone up on Sky Parlor Hill for a better view. It had been said that the Federal guns had never been sufficiently elevated to throw shell and shot so high as Parlor Hill. Yet I should not like to risk my life for mere curiosity's sake, when it was not possible to be of any service. The Sky Parlor Hill is so called from its extreme height, being a portion of the bluff that stood where the principal commercial street now stands, the grade in the city having taken most of the elevation down. The hill now occupies about a square, the distance of 2 squares from the river, and is a prominent feature from all parts of the city. A rugged drive winds on one side up the steep ascent, and a long and dizzy flight of wooden steps ascend from the street on the opposite side. It is surmounted by a little house that one could imagine surmounted the beanstalk, in the celebrated history of Jack, quaint and old, yet one that the earlier inhabitants would have called a fine house. The view, and that is what the place is visited for, is good, both of the city and river for some miles above. Crowds of people collect here on the occasion of any move being made in the direction of the river. A large truck was picked up after the sinking of the Cincinnati, belonging to a surgeon on board. It contained valuable surgical instruments and could not be procured in the Confederacy. A letter also written to the gentleman's wife previous to the departure of the fleet from above, telling her that the letter would be mailed at Vicksburg, as there was no doubt whatever that the place would be taken when an attack was made from the river. It was also said that Commodore Porter was aboard the Cincinnati. How the fact was ascertained, no one could tell. Shortly after the sinking of the Cincinnati, I received a note from M. saying that he was very much troubled in regard to our safety in the city, fearing that some time a mortar shell might fall on our cave, or that the constant jarring of the earth from the near explosion might cause it to seam and fall upon us. Therefore he decided to have a home made for me near the battlefield where he was stationed, one that would be entirely out of reach of the mortar shells. I was positively shocked at the idea. Going to the battlefield, where ball and shell fell without intermission. Was M in earnest? I could scarcely believe it. A friend came soon after and told me that I would find my home on the battlefield far more pleasant and safe than the one in town, that we were protected from the fragments only in our cave, that on the battlefield the missiles were of far less weight and falling far less dangerous. We were to experience our last and nearest explosion of the never to be forgotten mortar shells before we left. M had written to me to be ready on the following night. As the moon was not shining, the firing from the Federal batteries would cease at dark. After we would go without interruption. I was delighted at the prospect of a change in our mouldy lives, and looked forward to our ride, after dark though it was, with the utmost pleasure. Chapter 16. I was sitting near the entrance about 5 o'clock, thinking of the pleasant change, oh bless me, that tomorrow would bring, when the bombardment commenced more furiously than usual, the shells falling thickly around us, causing vast columns of smoke to fly upward, mingled with smoke. As usual, I was uncertain whether to remain within or run out. As the rocking and trembling of the earth was very distinctly felt, and the explosions alarmingly near, I stood within the mouth of the cave ready to make my escape, should one chance to fall above our domicile. In my anxiety I was startled by the shouts of the servants, and a most fearful jar and rocking of the earth, followed by a deafening explosion such as I had never heard before. The cave filled instantly with powder smoke and dust. I stood with a tingling, pringling sensation in the head, hands, and feet, and with a confused brain. Yet alive was the first glad thought that came to me. Child, servants, all here and saved from some great danger, I felt. I stepped out to find a group of persons before my cave looking anxiously for me, and lying all around freshly torn rose bushes, arbor vitae trees, large clods of earth, splinters, pieces of plank, wood, etc. A mortar shell had struck the corner of the cave, fortunately so near the brow of the hill that it had gone obliquely into the earth, exploding as it went, breaking large masses from the side of the hill, tearing away the fence, the shrubbery and flowers, sweeping all like an avalanche down near the entrance of my good refuge. I stood dismayed and surveyed the havoc that had been made around me, while our little family under it all had been mercifully preserved. Though many of the neighboring servants had been standing near at the time, no one had been injured in the slightest degree, yet pieces of plank, fragments of earth, and splinters had fallen in all directions. A portion of earth from the roof of my cave had been dislodged and fallen. Saving this, it remained intact. That evening some friends sat with me. One took up my guitar and played some pretty little airs for us, yet the noise of the shells threw a discord among the harmonies. To me it seemed like the crushing and bitter spirit of hate near the light and grace of happiness. How could we sing and laugh amid our suffering fellow beings, amid the shriek of death itself? This, only breaking the daily monotony of our lives, this thrilling knowledge of sudden and horrible death occurring near us, told tonight and forgotten in tomorrow's renewal. The sad news of a Vicksburg day. A little negro child playing in the yard had found a shell, and rolling and turning it had innocently pounded the fuse. The terrible explosion followed, showing, as the white cloud of smoke floated away, the mangled remains of a life that to the mother's heart had possessed all of beauty and joy. A young girl, becoming weary in the confinement of the cave, hastily ran to the house in the interval that elapsed between the slowly falling shells. On returning, an explosion sounded near her, one wild scream, and she ran into her mother's presence, sinking like a wounded dove, the life blood flowing over the light summer dress and crimson ripples from a death wound in her side, caused by the shell fragment. A fragment had also struck and broken the arm of a little boy playing near the mouth of his mother's cave. This one day's account. I told of my little girl's great distress when the shells fell thickly near us, how she ran to me breathless, hiding her head in my dress without a word, then cautiously looking out, with her anxious face questioning, would say, "Oh, mamma, was it a mortar shell?" Poor children, that their little hearts should suffer and quail amid these daily horrors of war. The next evening, about 4 o'clock, M's dear face appeared. He told us that he had heard of all danger through which we had passed, and was extremely anxious to have us reach out of reach of the mortar shells and near him. He also thought we would find our new home on the battlefield far superior to this. He wished us to go out as soon as possible. As at this hour in the evening for the last week the Federal guns had been quiet until almost sundown. He urged me to be ready to the shortest time possible, so I hastened our arrangements, and we soon were in the ambulance driving with great speed toward the rifle pits. Oh, the beautiful sunlight and the fresh evening air! How glowing and delightful it all seemed after my incarceration under the earth! I turned to look again and again at the setting sun and the brilliant crimson glow that suffused the atmosphere. All seemed glad and radiant, the sky, the flowers and trees along our drive, the cool and fragrant breeze, all save now and then the sullen boom of the mortar as it slowly cast its death-dealing shell over the life we were leaving behind us. Were it not for the poor soul still within, I could have clapped my hands in a glad, defiant jubilee as I heard the reports, for thought I was leaving my greatest fear of our old enemy in the desolate cave of which I had taken my last contemptuous glance. Yet the fear returned forcibly to me afterward. Chapter 17. The road we were traveling was graded out through the hills, and on every side we could see, thickly strewn among the earthy cliffs, the never to be lost sight of caves and little caves, some cut out substantially, roomy and comfortable, with braces and props throughout, many only large enough for one man to take refuge in. Standing again at a low place in the earth was a seat for a passer-by in case of danger. Driving on rapidly, we reached the suburbs of the city where the road became shady and pleasant. still with caves at every large road excavation, reminding one very much of the numberless holes that swallows make in summer. For both the mortar and parrot shells disputed this district, and a cave, front in whatever direction it might, was not secure from fragments. M impatiently urged the driver, fearing that when the firing recommenced, we would still be on the road. Suddenly a turn of the drive brought in sight two large forts on the hills above us, and passing down a ravine near one of these, the ambulance stopped. Here we saw two or three of the little shell and bomb-proof houses in the earth, covered with logs and turf. We were hastily taken out and started for our home when I heard a cutting of the air, the most expressive term I can use for that peculiar sound, above my head, and the balls dropped thickly around me, bringing leaves and small twigs from the trees with them. I felt a sudden rush to my heart, but the soldiers were camped near, and many stood consciously watching the effect of the sudden fall of metal around me. I would not for the world have shown fear, so braced my pride. I walked with a firm and steady pace, notwithstanding the treacherous suggestions of my heart that beat a loud "Run, run!" and fearing every side that I might fall by his side, hurried me anxiously along. Within a short distance was the adjutant's office, where we took refuge until the firing became less heavy. Here we found friends, and sat chatting some time. The office was a square excavation made in the side of the hill, covered over with logs and earth, seemingly quite cool and comfortable. I had been confined for so long a time in a narrow space of earth that daylight, green trees, and ample room became a new pleasure to me. At sundown there was a cessation in the rapid fall of balls and shells, and we again started for our home. I was taken up a little footpath that led from the ravine up under a careless, graceful arch of wild grapevines, whose swinging branchlets were drawn aside, and a low, long room cut into the hillside and shaded by the growth of forest trees around was presented to my view as our future home. What a pleasant place, after the close little cave in the city! Large enough for two rooms, the back and sides solid walls of earth, the sloping of the hill bringing down the wall to about 4 feet at the entrance, leaving the spaces above, between the wall and roof, for light. The side looking out on the road through the ravine was entirely open, yet shaded from view by the clustering vines over the pathway. I took possession delightedly. A blanket hung across the center, made us two good-sized rooms, the front room with a piece of carpet laid down to protect us from the dampness of the floor, and two or three chairs formed our little parlor, and the back room, quiet and retired, the bedroom. Over the top of the earth, or our house, held up by huge forked props, were the trunks of small trees laid closely across together. Over that, brush, limbs, and leaves, and covering all this, the thickness of 2 or 3 feet of earth beaten down compactly, and thought perfectly safe from Minnie balls and parrot or shrapnel shells. We had our tent fly drawn over the front, making a very pleasant veranda, for a narrow terrace had been made along the entrance, from which the hill sloped abruptly down to the road in the ravine opposite the dwelling. In the rear, the hill rose steeply above us. All was quiet tonight, as it usually is, I was told, when the moon is not brightly shining. The Federal commanders fear that the Confederates will strive to improve their defenses by the moonlight, which is certainly done, firing or not, for the fortifications need constant strengthening, being frequently badly torn by the parrot shells. The next morning at 4 o'clock I was awakened by a perfect tumult in the air. The explosion of shrapnel and the rattling of shrapnel balls around us reminded me that my dangers and cares were not yet over. How rapidly and thickly the shells and Minnie balls fell! Parrot of various sizes, canister and solid shot, until I was almost deafened by the noise and explosions. I lay and thought of the poor soldiers down below in the ravine, with only their tents over their heads, and it seemed in this storm of missiles that all must be killed. How strange so few casualties occur during these projectile storms! Our little home stood the test nobly. We were in the first line of hills back of the heights that were fortified, and of course we felt the full force of the very energetic firing that was constantly kept up, and being so near, many that passed over the first line of hills would fall directly around us. Chapter 18th. How dewy and pleasant the morning! I stood looking out from the little terrace, breathing the fresh air, and learning the new surroundings so far as my eye went, for it was not safe to venture out from the covering of the cave, the ravine fronting me, shady, dark, and cool, the sun just rising over the hilltop and lighting the upper limbs of the large trees. Up the ravine, the headquarters, horses were tethered, lazily rising and shaking their coats after the night's rest on the ground, shaking off their drowsiness to begin the breakfast of mulberry leaves. Amidst the constant falling of rifle balls, the birds sang as sweetly and flew as gaily from tree to tree, as if there were peace and plenty in the land. Plenty there certainly was not in Vicksburg, as anyone would have said who had been invited to our little breakfast that morning. Bacon side and bread were all, and I had become so accustomed to them that I obeyed the calls to breakfast with reluctance, eating most practically to sustain life without the slightest relish for the food I was compelled to masticate and swallow. Yet all received their trials with cheerfulness. The gentleman who breakfasted with us that morning laughed and made merry over the rations, and told me of the mule meat that was soon to be served up to us. They were speaking of a charge that had been made most gallantly by General Burbridge and the Federal troops of his command on the Confederate entrenchments. They had rushed over the breastworks and into the rifle pits, driving out the Southern soldiers. The whole Confederate camp near the spot arose in a furious excitement, officers and men alike throwing hand grenades down upon the intruders until they were forced to retire, after holding the place some little time. I was told that General Burbridge had laughingly remarked to a Confederate officer during the truce that staying in the entrenchments in the hot sun and having hand grenades thrown at him in profusion was warm a work as he wished to undertake in one day. After the Federal troops left the entrenchments, a hole was found in the loose earth of the breastworks that caused much amusement among the Confederate soldiers. A large hole where one of the Federals had literally burrowed his way out from the pits. "I reckon he's some kin to a mole," sagely commented one of the soldiers. A flag of truce had been sent by the Federal commander asking leave to bury the killed and remove the wounded that had been left on the field in one of the charges that had been made on the Confederate lines. The request had been refused by General Pemberton. Afterward, the effluvia from the dead bodies became so intolerable that he was obliged in his turn to ask a truce and request the Federal officers bury their dead. I was distressed to hear of a young Federal lieutenant who had been severely wounded and left on the field by his comrades. He had lived in this condition from Saturday until Monday, lying in the burning sun without water or food, and the men on both sides could witness the agony of the life prolonged without the power to assist him in any way. I was glad indeed when I heard the poor man had expired on Monday morning. Another soldier left on the field, badly wounded in the leg, had begged most piteously for water, and lying near the Confederate entrenchments, his cries were all directed to the Confederate soldiers. The firing was heaviest where he lay, and would have been at the risk of a life to have gone to him. Yet a Confederate soldier asked and obtained leave to carry water to him, and stood and fanned him in the midst of the firing, while he eagerly drank from the heroic soldier's canteen. The officer who related this little incident had not yet obtained the name of the noble man. Truly, the bravest are the tenderest, the loving are the daring. How generous, how truly brave the man who would thus dare death, who would at the risk of life perform a truly Christian deed. Oh, were all men but true followers of the Prince of Peace, how short would be this warfare! Did only individual Christians strive to do their duty in every respect, this great suffering would not be upon us. There are enough in the world who worship him who died that might all be happy, enough to stand before the heads of the Christian nation and plead in his name that there be mercy for these dying and bleeding thousands, that these brothers, sons, and husbands may not lie torn, swollen and writhing in the hot sun, with burning eyes and parched tongues, far, far from those who are powerless to succor them in this fearful time, and with these pleadings would ascend prayers to him who rewards the peacemakers as the children of God, prayers from many an aching, tear-seared heart, and the fierce bitterness, strife, and hatred that move men so would pale before this blessing. Should they fail and the wrong go on, then they have done their duty, and they will find mercy not where the air of man's judgment withholds it, but before Him whom the least of these are incalculable value. One morning George made an important discovery, a newly made stump of sassafras very near the cave, with large roots extending in every direction, affording us an inexhaustible vein of tea for future use. We had been drinking water with our meals previous to this disclosure. Coffee and tea had long since been among the things that were in the army. We, however, were more fortunate than many of the officers, having access to an excellent cistern near us, while many of our friends used muddy water or river water, which, being conveyed so great a distance, became extremely warm and agreeable. I think I'm going to end this session. I'm on page 104. There's a little over 190, well, 196 pages. So I will do a part two. It's taken me a little bit longer than I thought, but thank you for your attention and stay safe, everybody, and have a good night. Let's see.